The story of All in a Day's work unfolds in a world both familiar and alien, where the mundane and the uncanny exist side by side, indifferent to the fragile certainties of human life. Fiona Flynn, a solitary practitioner of white magic, lives in a modest home with her young son, Ian. Fiona's days are filled with quiet incantations and the endless balancing act of motherhood, a life pulled taut between duty and the ever-present hum of otherworldly forces. One day, a man named Stephen Rose, a professor with a distracted air of desperation, arrives at her doorstep. His eyes betray sleepless nights. Haunted by a mistake he can barely articulate, he has called something into existence, a shadow that mirrors him with uncanny precision, but lacks his warmth of a soul. This doppelganger moves with intent, inching ever closer to overtaking his life. It is not fear that drives Stephen to Fiona, but the suffocating weight of inevitability. He does not seek salvation as much as an explanation, a reason for why the world has so cruelly turned against him. Fiona agrees to help. Her motives ambiguous, a mix of professional obligation and a vague sense of dread that lingers after Stephen leaves. She decides to summon a demon named Belphamech, an entity both cunning and cruel, whose knowledge of such phenomena might provide a solution after all. But summoning such a creature is no simple task. The air becomes heavy in her home, the walls seem to shrink, and even young Ian senses the shift. The demon appears, its presence an affront to the natural order. It does not offer answers freely, nor does it hide its disdain for the mortals who have called it forth. Fiona negotiates, her voice steady though her heart quivers, but Stephen, unused to the precarious dance of the arcane, falters. His doubt, his fear, his very humanity invites chaos. Belphamech does not merely observe, but revels, its laughter cutting through the air like shattered glass. In the midst of the ritual, Ian, drawn by a child's naive curiosity, interrupts. The demon shifts its attention to him, and for a moment, Fiona's carefully constructed world teeters on the edge of collapse. She is a mother first, a sorceress second, and in this moment, the two roles collide with catastrophic force. The balance is lost. The doppelganger emerges stronger, no longer content to linger in Stephen's shadow. Its movements grow confident, its intentions malevolent. The resolution, if it can be called that, is a compromise neither satisfying nor just. The doppelganger is banished, but at a cost Fiona and Stephen can scarcely comprehend. Belphamech departs, leaving behind a silence that feels more oppressive than its presence. The house is unchanged, yet nothing feels as it was. Stephen walks away a diminished man, his gratitude hollow, his eyes more haunted than when he arrived. Fiona returns to Ian, holding him tightly, as if to tether herself to the only thing that feels real. And yet the shadows in her home linger, just a little too long. The air, though still, seems to breathe. The episode closes with Fiona staring into the dim light of her son's room, her thoughts spiraling. She has won, she tells herself, but in the dim glow of her solitude, the question remains, at what cost? What is it that we truly fear when we encounter our double? What is it about this confrontation that seems to echo the most profound terror of the human soul? In our unconscious lies an uncomfortable truth. We're not who we think we are. Our most deeply held beliefs about identity, those comforting narratives we weave around ourselves to make sense of the world, are fragile constructions, perpetually vulnerable to the collapse that is inevitable when faced with the return of the repressed. This return is the true essence of the uncanny, the shattering of the illusion that we have mastered our own sense of self. When the doppelganger appears, it is as though a part of us has escaped and taken on a life of its own. We may try to reject it, to distance ourselves from its eyes that stare back at us with knowing and unfeeling intensity, yet the more we attempt to run from it, the closer it comes, creeping into the corners of our psyche, like an insect that has nested itself beneath our skin. It's not an alien force, but something far more insidious, a fragment of our own being, forgotten or buried, that insists on being recognized. In All in a Day's Work, the protagonist finds that the doppelganger is not just an external force, but an internalized shadow, one that cannot be easily discarded. It mirrors not only the surface fears and desires, but the internal cracks in the psyche, fractures that reveal the inherent instability of the self. Just as in Kafka's The Trial, where the protagonist Joseph K. is perpetually besieged by forces beyond his understanding, so too does the protagonist in this episode face an invisible court, a judgment of the self that cannot be evaded. The doppelganger stands as the physical embodiment of the judgment, and like the fate of Joseph K., there is no escape, only the slow, inevitable unraveling. Freud defines the uncanny as the return of the repressed, the feeling that something familiar becomes unsettling because it straddles the boundary between the known and the unknown. The idea of the unheimlich, literally unhomely or unfamiliar, describes the feeling that something once familiar is seen in an alien or disturbing light. At its heart, the uncanny evokes an eerie discomfort, a tension between the comfort of the known and the terror of the unknown. This phenomenon, according to Freud at least, often arises when elements of our psyche that we have suppressed re-emerge, threatening our sense of identity and reality. The uncanny, as Freud defines it, emerges when something that should be familiar, like our own image, becomes frightening because it is experienced as alien. The doppelganger embodies this paradox. It is both a reflection of the self and a distortion of it. The encounter with the double represents a confrontation with repressed aspects of the self, revealing parts of the psyche that the individual may wish to ignore or suppress. Freud suggests that the uncanny arises when these repressed elements return in a form that is simultaneously familiar and unsettling, challenging the boundaries of identity. For Freud, the doppelganger represents an existential threat. It is a symbol of the human fear of death and the breakdown of identity. The double serves as a reminder that the self is fragile and that the boundaries of the I are not as secure as we might like to believe. The doppelganger's appearance triggers anxiety because it reveals that our identity is not as fixed or singular as we might hope. Instead, it is a fragmented and malleable construct, vulnerable to external influences and internal conflicts. The uncanny element of the doppelganger lies in its ability to provoke recognition and fear. The double's familiar appearance challenges the individual's sense of self, while its alien behavior or intentions create unease. The doppelganger forces the person to reckon with the possibility that they are not in full control of their own identity, and that their repressed fears and desires may return to haunt them in unexpected ways. And so, the story ends, or rather it curls back on itself, a snake devouring its own tail. The doppelganger does not vanish with the flicker of a screen. It remains a splinter lodged beneath the skin of your reality. You see it in the ordinary, the pause in a stranger's step that mirrors your own, the faint trace of someone's shadow where no one should be. It is not the loud, not the brash. It is patient. It waits in the spaces between, in the cracks where certainty falters and the air grows thin. To encounter your double is to encounter the endless bureaucracy of existence itself, the looping paperwork of identity, the unfilled forms of your buried past, and the unyielding official stamping a seal on your fears. What is it that the doppelganger seeks to tell you, dear viewer? That you are more than one but never whole? That your life is both uniquely yours and entirely borrowed? The uncanny is not a nightmare from which you awaken. It is the waking world, stripped of its disguises. And now, you are awake, aren't you? Aware of your every gesture, your every step, watching, yourself watching, listening for the echo of a voice you swear is yours. But perhaps it is not the doppelganger haunting you at all. Perhaps it is you who haunt it. What is more terrifying than being one's own ghost? Take care as you turn off the lights tonight. You might catch a glimpse of something familiar slipping into the dark, or perhaps it will simply wait forever. Check out this video next.